Hello everyone, this is HLSZ111, the Person, Health and Wellbeing. This is week 5 and we'll be discussing coping, resilience and vulnerability. These are the high-level learning outcomes. These are the graduate attributes. And these are the specific learning outcomes for this session. So at the end of this class, we would hope that you can explain and understand resilience and vulnerability, understand and distinguish between coping and resilience, understand how stress or adversity and vulnerability and resilience interact, understand and distinguish between risk and protective factors, identify the role of support, both from individuals and in groups, and also in terms of social context, identify and discuss various theories of coping. Some of that is going to reinforce your learnings from last week. So just to get started then, recap on the impact of stress. Last week we looked at stress and the models of stress. We said that stress impacts the person physiologically, psychologically, behaviorally and socially. And we talked about a number of symptoms that could be categorized within each of these. So for example, we talked about physical manifestations of stress as being perhaps cold, clammy hands, sweating, difficulty swallowing, muscular tension, migraines and headaches, pain, fatigue. We also talked about disturbances in eating and sleeping, and gastrointestinal discomfort and restlessness. In terms of psychological manifestations of stress, we spoke about worry, anxiety, anger, powerlessness, hopelessness, lack of concentration or poor concentration, and we also talked about stress being a precursor to perhaps more serious mental health problems like anxiety and depression, as well as substance use. In terms of behavioral and social manifestations of stress, we spoke about the fact that negative feelings such as anxiety, anger, sadness, shame, guilt, perhaps even boredom might manifest into behaviors that are then negative in and of themselves and that reinforce the feeling of being stressed. Stress can also affect our immunity. It can put us at increased risk for cancer and cardiovascular disease. It can have an effect on our cognitive selves, our emotional selves. Although it is difficult to link stress as a sole cause of disease, we did speak about the fact that it is closely aligned to poor outcomes in those that are already ill. So some factors that influence the effect of stress, we spoke about the nature of the stressor, the duration of the stressor, how much it can have an effect, a cumulative effect over time, how the person appraises cognitively the nature of that stressor, whether the person can predict the stress or have control over the stress, and so on. So we spoke about all these things last week. If these are sounding new to you, then I strongly suggest that you review last week's lecture. One of the major influences on the level of impact of the stressor on a person is the actual nature of the stressor itself. So is it a positive stressor? Is it a negative stressor? Is it acute? Is it chronic? Is it a major life event? Or is it something small? When we're thinking about positive and negative, remember that we talked about positive stress as eustress, which can be experienced as exciting or challenging, which although has physical responses that are similar to negative stress, they are short-lasting and are exhilarating or motivating as opposed to being experienced as a problem and creating distress. So now let me introduce you to the concept of psychoneuroimmunology, which examines the influence of psychosocial factors on the functioning of the immune system. The immune system is the body's surveillance and security system, which detects and eliminates disease-causing agents in the body, such as bacteria and viruses. There are three important types of cells in the immune system: B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells. B cells produce antibodies. They produce protein molecules that attach themselves to foreign invaders. T cells search and directly destroy invaders, whilst other cells stimulate immune functioning. So the research has now focused on the capacity of psychological factors, things like mood, thought suppression, and stress, to modify that immune functioning. And broadly speaking, it has been discovered that positive mood enhances the immune system functioning and that stress depresses the immune system. Given that most people experience at least some degree of stress almost on a daily basis, why do some people cope with stress more successfully than others? Is it related to the environment that they find themselves in? Or is it more to do with personality traits that they have? Or is it indeed to do with coping skills that they possess? Well, in fact, it is all of these, but the most helpful dynamic for understanding this, it's probably the resilience and vulnerability dynamic, where some degree of adversity is mediated or mitigated by either the presence or the lack of a protective factor, which then creates a risk or a risk factor. But before we go too far in this, we have talked about resilience last week, and we will do so extensively this week, but we haven't yet come across the vulnerability term, so I'll just define that for you now. Vulnerability is where someone is easily hurt or harmed physically, mentally, or emotionally. So they can be open to attack, open to harm, or open to damage in a way that others are not. So protective factors prepare you to cope well with adverse events. Risk factors are those that hinder your efforts to cope well with adverse events. And so protective and risk factors are attributes that exist before these stressful events. But what do you do after the stressful event? Well, this is where coping and resilience come into their own. Coping are the behaviors and activities that you do after the stressful event, and resilience, as we've suggested before, is a term that's used to describe people who cope with stress in an adaptive way. They use physical, emotional, and psychological attributes in order to not be overwhelmed by adverse events. So, what makes for a resilient individual and what makes for a vulnerable individual? Well, it probably won't surprise you that in fact most of the research looks at risk factors associated with three domains that we've met before. These are the personal, the family, and the social context or domain. In terms of the personal, people with low self-esteem, with poor social skills, with poor problem solving, sometimes with difficult temperament or lack of empathy, and poor conceptual skills, are often the people that are identified as vulnerable or express vulnerability. In terms of the family context, having come from a poor or deprived background where there's also been poor parenting skills, so there's been history of neglect or harsh or abusive parenting, there's been rejection, there's been exposure to substance abuse or crime, sometimes malnutrition. The child themselves might have a history of emotional problems and homelessness, often early school leaving. So these are the features of someone, again, that might experience vulnerabilities in the context that we're talking. In terms of social factors, unsurprisingly, family violence, poor parental supervision, harsh or inconsistent discipline, lack of warmth from caregivers, abuse or neglect, having grown up in a neighbourhood that's deprived, that might have violence and crime, lack of support services. Those are the kinds of things that in the social sphere contribute to vulnerability. So now we're going to take a more detailed look at coping. We're going to look at the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral responses that people have to stresses and understand these from a problem-focused context or an emotion-focused context. And we're also going to talk about whether coping can be adaptive, that is, it can improve the situation that a person finds themselves in, or maladaptive, where there is no change to the difficult or stressful situation, or that in fact it leads to further problems. And we're going to explore this notion of resiliency, which is the capacity to bounce back, adapting well to the stress that is in front of us, and that is adaptive. So, coping strategies are behavioral responses and thought and emotional processes that people use to deal actively with sources of stress. We looked at these back in week 4. Again, feel free to review this material. We looked at problem-focused and emotion-focused, and we spoke about social support as well. When we're thinking about coping, we think about 3 C's, essentially: control, challenge, and commitment. Control refers to the internal source of power that we might choose to have in responding to stresses, and it is often explained as refusal to be a victim. In terms of challenge, this is where the person sees change not as threatening, but as an opportunity for growth, and it is tightly linked to being hopeful. In terms of commitment, this is where curiosity and deep involvement with what's going on around us allows us to find meaning and purpose, so that the stressor is then cognitively appraised in a different way than just being pure challenge. Referring back to last week, we are reminded that locus of control is the extent to which people believe that they have power over their lives. So if a person has an internal focus of control, they believe that he or she can influence events and their outcomes, while someone with an external focus of control believes that outside forces control their lives. The concept was brought to light by Julian Rotter, and the underlying question regarding their focus of control is this: so, do I control my life, or does something or someone else control it? Related to locus of control is sense of coherence, developed by Antonovsky in the 70s. It is defined as the extent to which one has pervasive, enduring, though dynamic, feelings of confidence that one's environment is predictable and that things will work out as well as can be reasonably expected. In other words, it's a mixture of optimism and control. The concept, as I said, was developed by Aaron Antonovsky to explain why some people become ill under stress and others stay healthy. It arose from a search for the origins of health rather than looking at the causes of disease. And it's gained widespread attention now and has since been linked to health outcomes in many studies. It's got 3 components: meaningfulness, manageability, and comprehensibility. Meaningfulness is how much one feels that life makes sense and challenges are worthy of commitment. Manageability is the extent to which a person feels that they can cope with whatever life brings up. And comprehensibility is the extent to which events are perceived as making logical sense, that they are ordered, that they're consistent, that they are structured. As well as locus of control and sense of coherence, gender has been used to explain differences between the experience of stress and distress amongst people. So, studies on psychological distress have consistently reported that women experience more distress than men. I guess the question arises then, why is this the case? Why are women seemingly more prone to psychological distress compared to men. Well, the existing literature indicates that there are various possible explanations for this phenomenon. Some scholars have suggested that women find themselves in more stressful situations more often than men. Other researchers have suggested that it is possible that women assess threatening events as more stressful than men do. Others have suggested that women experience gender-specific stresses, things like gender violence and sexist discrimination, which are associated with women's physical and psychiatric events. And others still have indicated that, in fact, women may be more affected by the stress that they see around them, so they're more influenced by their environment and they tend to be more emotionally involved than men in social and family networks, and therefore they experience more stress. Spirituality is yet another context that explains why some people are able to show resiliency and adapt to stresses, or are able to display vulnerability and maladapt to stress. So over the past 2 decades, there's been a whole body of research that's documented the important links between religiousness and health. Although work in this area remains highly controversial, the weight of evidence seems to indicate that aspects of religious participation and commitment have health effects in a whole range of health outcomes, ranging from mental health, things like depression and subjective well-being, to physical health, things like hypertension or physical mobility, and even to mortality risk, which was shown by Ellison and Levin in the 1990s. And so we arrive at social support, which is probably the most expansive area of research that's shown that with some interaction in the social support element of people's lives, we can make a big difference and shift people from being vulnerable to being resilient. In terms of social support, things like being able to seek and receive assistance from friends and relatives and support groups, things like being able to access material goods, so money, housing, food, being able to access emotional support so that they can express how they're feeling and have that reflected back in a validating way, and to have some kind of either systemic or personal support for actually getting things done, so having access to a court system, helping out with childcare arrangements. All of these things seem to really strengthen someone's ability to actually cope with stress or not. The most important element of social support is having a social network. And so studies have shown that people with extensive social networks have fewer upper respiratory infections, they've got lower incidence of stroke and cardiovascular disease, they may have lower risk of cancer recurrence and lower incidence of dementia. So extensive social networks include different types of relationships, not necessarily the standard ones that we think of when we think of the family structure, but it could be marriage, it could be different types of close relationships, and it could be belonging to social, political, or religious groups. There are protective factors that come from group interaction or social networks that would then help an individual to overcome their own individual challenges. These are things like hope, universality, information sharing, altruism, better experiencing or re-experiencing relationships, developing new skills in socializing, learning by watching, group cohesiveness, and catharsis. These things all develop something called social capital. Social capital is defined as networks together with shared norms, values, and understandings that facilitate cooperation within or among groups. In this definition, we can think of networks as real-world links between groups or individuals. Think of networks of friends or family networks or networks of former colleagues and so on. Our shared norms, values and understandings are less concrete than our social networks. And so the idea of social capital might be difficult in the first instance to kind of realize. But it's all the things that we've just been looking at in the previous slide. All these protective factors are elements of social capital. Broadly speaking, there are three types of social capital: bonding, bridging, and linking. Bonding is where you develop links to people that are like you. Bridging is where you develop links to people that are not necessarily like you, but can offer help. And linking is where you build links with people on a different step in the social ladder, but again, can help you in the context that you find yourself in. So why does social support work then? There are essentially two theories that explain why social support works: the main effects model and the stress buffering model. You can see that these are somewhat dated now. We tend to tell you to reference ideas that are current, and yet here I am telling you about two theories that were really espoused during the 80s. So I guess a challenge to you, as well as understanding these foundational theories that explain how social support works, see if you can have a look at whether there's more recent work on these theories or other theories that explain why social support works. But just to explain the main effects model, it maintains that social networks provide regular positive experiences, that they develop a set of stable roles, and that this stability leads to stability of mood. So there's a space for people to enjoy themselves, to find things predictable, to be able to recognize the worth of the group and the worth of themselves. These result in events that are accepted and not seen as threatening. The stress buffering model maintains that social support is an intervening factor between stress and the perception of a threat. And so if you believe that you have adequate resources to cope, then this reduces the cognitive, emotional, and physiological arousal caused by the stressor. There are some distinct factors that have been shown to affect social networks. Gender, again, is an element here. So men and women have different networks. Women have been shown to have more extensive or intimate networks. They emphasize caring, interdependence, and expressiveness, whereas men are sociable, but they tend to be task-oriented in that sociability. Mental health is also a factor, so that people suffering from severe mental health problems, things like schizophrenia, depression, psychosis, are unable to form and maintain the social networks that they had before they became ill, and so they become more vulnerable. Class has also been shown to be a factor. So as we've grown away from the old working class areas, there's been research that's shown that neighbours have become less and less important within that social network, and we've become more and more distant from our neighbours. So yes, this might be good in terms of reflecting our wealth and our independence in modern life, but it's also impactful in terms of where our social network sits and who we can rely on. So we've been talking a lot about resilience, and I introduced the notion of resilience last week, but really we haven't spent a great deal of time just concentrating on resilience itself. We've explained that resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, in the face of trauma, perhaps, in the face of tragedy, in the face of stress. So things like family and relationship problems, serious health problems, workplace, financial stresses, these are all situations where resilience is needed. And so we need to bounce back from these kinds of stresses. And so resilience then can be defined as being able to adapt well to adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, and other significant sources of stress. The research has shown, though, that resilience is quite ordinary. It is not extraordinary. It's not as though you have to have some innate something within you that makes you resilient. In fact, people commonly demonstrate resilience, and being resilient does not mean that a person doesn't experience difficulty or distress, but rather that they can adapt to that and overcome it. So emotional pain and sadness are common in people who've suffered major adversities or trauma in their lives, and in fact the road to resilience is likely to involve considerable emotional distress, because it's that exposure to distress that then allows one to develop the internal and external resources to overcome stress generally. So resilience is not a trait that people either have or don't have. It involves behaviors, it involves thoughts, it involves actions that can be learned and developed by anyone. So it is possible that some people may be more biologically predisposed towards being more resilient, but psychological and environmental factors can contribute to its development. So developing resilience is a personal journey. People do not all react the same way to traumatic or stressful life events. An approach to building resilience that works for one person may not work for another. And so people use varying strategies to overcome stress and become resilient. Research has shown that there's been some variation in how resilience expresses itself in different cultures. So a person's culture might have an impact on how he or she communicates feelings and deals with adversity. So for example, whether and how a person connects with significant others, or where and how someone accesses extended family members and community resources. With growing diversity, the public has greater access to a number of different approaches to building resilience. And we're asking this question now, why is resilience so important? But in fact, over the course of the last 2 weeks, the question's already been answered, because it is rare for individuals never to be confronted with stress or adversity. There are always going to be challenging circumstances in our lives, and people who are resilient tend to be able to use those inner strengths and resources to be able to bounce back given those challenges. So just to make it quite clear, resilience is not about a lack of symptoms of distress. It is not about being able to forget painful memories. It is not about not being traumatized. And it is not about not getting upset when recalling traumatic or painful memories. It is not about adapting to the new normal. And it is not about just coping with adverse life events. So how does resilience then manifest itself within resilient people? Well, resilient people have the capacity to make realistic plans and take steps to carry them out. They have a positive view of themselves and confidence in their strengths and abilities. They have skills in communication and problem solving, and they have the capacity to manage strong feelings and impulses. At this point, it's probably good to put the more theoretical aspects of the conversation that we've been having this week into a practical and personal reflection. So focusing on past experiences and sources of personal strength might help you with strategies for building resilience that work for you. By exploring answers to the following questions about yourself and your reactions to challenging life events, you might discover how you respond effectively to difficult situations in your life. Consider the following questions. What kinds of events have been most stressful for you? How have those events typically affected you? Have you found it helpful to think of important people in your life when you're feeling distressed? To whom have you reached out for support in working through a traumatic or stressful experience? What have you learned about yourself and about your interactions with others during difficult times? Has it been helpful for you to assist someone else, perhaps, going through a similar experience? And have you been able to overcome obstacles? And if so, how have you done that? These are important questions to reflect upon for your own resilience, in developing your own resilience, but also if you're going to become a healthcare practitioner of some description, to develop resilience in your patients and health consumers more broadly. Personal resilience, we know, is related to biological elements, certainly attachment and, of course, control. So from a biological point of view, we know that there are genetic characteristics that make us more likely to be resilient, things like temperament and personality. We also know that control over our emotions and exercising our emotions, as well as our intelligence, can lead to immune responses to disease. So there's obviously an element of biology in there. In terms of attachment, we've talked about how the capacity for bonding with our parental figures, and particularly our mothers, then allows us to develop empathy and develop relationships which then maintain us as well as maintaining others. And control. So we've talked both last week and this week about the control element being the capacity to manipulate the environment, to exercise social competence, to feel mastery over oneself and one's life. Also, control being very, very important in developing self-esteem and self-efficacy. Given the discussion that we've had over the course of the last couple of weeks, it won't surprise you that we can arrive at a formulation of the kinds of characteristics, beliefs, actions, and behaviours that resilient people demonstrate. Resilient people make connections. They develop good relationships with close family members, with friends, and with others that are important to them. They accept help and support from those that care about them. They are also active in civic groups, perhaps faith-based organisations and other local groups that provide social support to them, or that they can provide social support in time of need. They avoid seeing crises as insurmountable problems. They understand that they can't change the fact that highly stressful events happen, but that they can change how they interpret and respond to these events. They also accept that change is part of living. So certain goals may no longer be attainable as a result of adverse situations. They accept these new circumstances as being unable to be changed, and then focus on the things that they can alter. Resilient people also move towards goals. They develop realistic goals and do something regularly in order to move towards those goals. Instead of focusing on tasks that seem unachievable, they ask themselves, what can they do today in order to move in the direction that they want to go? Resilient people take decisive actions. They act on adverse situations as much as they can. They deal with this rather than detaching themselves completely from problems and stresses and wishing that they would just go away. Resilient people look for opportunities for self-discovery. They realise that people often learn something about themselves and might find that they've grown in some respect as a result of a struggle with loss. Resilient people nurture a positive view of themselves, so they develop confidence in their ability to solve problems and trust their instincts to help build resilience. Resilient people also keep things in perspective. Even when facing very painful events, they try to consider the stressful situation in a broader context and keep a long-term perspective. They certainly avoid blowing the event out of proportion. Resilient people maintain a hopeful outlook, so they know that an optimistic outlook enables people to expect that good things will happen in their lives. So they try to visualize what they want rather than worrying about what they fear. Resilient people know that they need to take care of themselves. They pay attention to their own needs and feelings. They engage in activities that they enjoy and find relaxing. They often exercise regularly. And they take care of their mind and body in a way that allows them to be in a very good situation when they require resilience. And resilient people have additional ways of strengthening resilience. So, for example, some people might write about their deepest thoughts and feelings related to trauma or other stressful events. Other people might engage in meditation or spiritual practices in a way to build connections and restore hope. You can see that from this long list of attributes that resilient people demonstrate, that there are principles that jump out both from the list and also from the wider literature that is related to resilience. And these are principles that relate to self-efficacy, to mastery over oneself or locus of control, to competence in and belief in one's own ability, and autonomy, that one can resolve one's problems. Self-efficacy is one of the main principles to arise time and time again in discussions around resilience. Self-efficacy is a person's belief about their ability or capacity to accomplish a goal. It is also known as confidence, and it's one of the most enabling psychological models to have been adopted into positive psychology. So you can see that there are some resounding benefits of resilience. It allows people to overcome obstacles, to cope with adversity, to recover from crisis. It makes them open to new experiences and makes them able to cope with those new experiences. It allows them to connect to others, to persist when there are challenges in their path, to succeed despite adversity, and to expand their horizons. There are relatively recent models of resilience that explain resilience from a psychobiological point of view. One of the most cited models of resilience is Charney 2004. Charney developed an integrative model of resilience and vulnerability that encompassed the neurochemical response patterns to acute stress and the neuromechanisms mediating reward, fear, conditioning, and extinction, as well as social behaviour. Charney 2004 identified 11 possible neurochemical, neuropeptide, and hormonal mediators of the psychobiological response to extreme stress. And he related these to resilience and to vulnerability. The neuromechanisms of reward and motivation, fear, responsiveness, and adaptive social behaviour were found to be relevant to the character traits associated with resilience. Resilience research has been with us since the 1970s. However, at that time, resilience was considered in terms of individual invulnerability and focused on individual characteristics such as temperament, intelligence, problem-solving skills, stress resistance that would harden children and enable them to achieve success. Most of these studies suggested that there was something remarkable about these children when they overcame great adversity. More recently, though, the notion of invulnerability has given way to a focus on the identification of protective factors that will ultimately reduce the impact of risk factors. Researchers have found that protective factors have a stronger impact on children's development than risk factors. Research points to problem-focused coping rather than avoidant or passive responses as being the most successful for a range of different adversities. This involves responding to hardship by modifying the elements of the environment or oneself that are contributing to the difficulty in question. As always, we need to be careful that we don't think in absolutes. There are qualifiers to any kind of research, and resilience research is no different. There are limitations. Enhancing resilience has become a key element of being prepared for extreme events or adverse events. Whilst much progress has been made in defining components of resilience, many questions remain about the identification of appropriate strategies for building resilience, also for understanding barriers to the implementation of these strategies and the limits of the potential effectiveness of these efforts. New questions are also emerging about the inherent limitations of resilience-based approaches, suggesting that resiliency efforts must be coupled with broader transformations of the social and political conditions that create vulnerabilities. There is a clear relationship between resilience, vulnerability, and the self. In order to understand resilience and vulnerability, it is necessary to understand the self. And in fact, we're now going to discuss a key concept for the understanding of resilience, which is self-concept. The self-concept is an overarching idea that we have about who we are. This is in the context of physical, emotional, social, and spiritual terms, and in fact, any other aspects that make up who we are. We form our self-concept as we grow, based on the knowledge that we have about ourselves. It is a multi-dimensional concept and can be broken down into the individual aspects of self. So, for example, you may have a very different idea of who you are in terms of your physical body and who you are in terms of your spirit or soul. I have found a couple of videos that can serve as resources for you to more effectively understand what we mean when we talk about self-concept. I can't play them here and now in this recorded lecture, but I will provide the links in Leo, and you can watch those whenever you like. When trying to understand self-concept as a construct, it is important not to get confused with other similar terms, things like self-esteem, self-image, self-efficacy, self-awareness. These are all constituent parts of the self-concept, but are not the same thing. So, for example, self-image is related to self-concept, but is generally less broad. Self-image is how an individual sees themselves and does not necessarily have to align with reality. A person's self-image is based only on how they see themselves, while self-concept is a more comprehensive evaluation of the self based on how a person sees themselves, values themselves, think about themselves, and feel about themselves. Carl Rogers, whom you might remember from week 1, posited that self-image is a component of self-concept, along with self-esteem and self-worth, and one's ideal self. Here is another resource that you might find useful in providing a deeper understanding of the self-concept. I've also made it available on Leo. Let's now shift our attention from the purely theoretical to the more practical by looking at the interaction between pain and resilience. Pain is one of the most common reasons for seeking healthcare, and it can be defined as an unpleasant and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage. This is the definition that is found in your textbook, Reiner and Upton 2013. There is a differentiation between acute pain and chronic pain. Acute pain is pain that occurs in the short term, generally the result of tissue damage or disease, and it usually improves over time as damage heals and lasts usually less than 6 months. Chronic pain is pain that occurs over the longer term, although this longer term varies in definition. Sometimes it is defined as greater than 6 weeks, sometimes greater than 6 months, and sometimes greater than 12 months. Examples of chronic pain are lower back pain, headaches, and pain associated with conditions such as arthritis. Pain theories, early pain theories suggested that pain was a direct response to a given stimulus, but more recent theories have expanded on this conceptualization of pain to encompass the psychosocial, so that researchers such as Sturgeon and Sauter, as well as Hassett and Finnan, have found that there are personal traits and resources that impact on the experience of pain when they looked at positive characteristics like optimism, purpose in life, acceptance of challenges, and resilience more broadly. So thinking about the kinds of things that you've learnt over the course of this lecture, do you think that there are interventions that you can put in place to help your patients if you think of yourself as a budding healthcare practitioner? Well, in fact, there are quite specific interventions that will encourage resilience, that will encourage coping, that will encourage self-sufficiency in your patients. These things are, for example, the use of therapeutic communication skills, offering your patients unconditional positive regard, assisting your patients to identify available supports, and assisting them to identify areas of strength they can use as resources. Also, looking at how to reduce their vulnerability and therefore reduce their risks. Also looking at reducing the number of stresses that they have in their present lives. Also exploring coping skills and strategies, perhaps establishing simple routines that they can follow. Also encouraging them rest, exercise and diet as appropriate, and encouraging them to discuss the issues that they are facing. Also outlining relaxation techniques that they might, again, use as resources to cope. Let's now shift to the second last point that I want to make in this lecture, which is the interaction between family and resilience. Keeping in mind the concepts related to resilience and the individual characteristics that are associated with resilience, let's now think about family resilience. A child's capacity to successfully adapt to adversity is firmly grounded within the social context, and the primary social context is the family. Family resilience can be defined as coping and adaptational processes in the family as a functional unit. Family resilience often offers a systems perspective that enables us to understand how family processes mediate stress and support individuals and families in managing crises. Individual resilience is best understood and fostered in the context of the family and the larger social world as a mutual interaction of individual, family, social, cultural, and institutional influences. There are fairly strict organisational patterns that pertain to the family. The family can extend to have a capacity for change or not. It can have the capacity for connectedness and cohesion or not. And it can be a gate to social and economic resources or not. There are three keys to family resilience: family belief systems, organisational patterns, and communication processes. In the context of family belief systems, we cope with crisis and adversity by making meaning of our experience. The meaning of adversity is filtered through family transactions. The ability to clarify and give meaning to a crisis is crucial for resilience. We know, for example, that high-functioning families hold a more optimistic view of life and a shared confidence about overcoming challenges. The second key aspect of family resilience is organisational patterns in the family. Families provide the structure to support adaptation of the family and its members. Organisational patterns are maintained by external and internal norms that are influenced by cultural and family belief systems. To manage adversity, families have to mobilise and organise their resources, they have to buffer stresses, and they have to reorganise themselves to fit changing needs and situations. In this context, families offer flexibility, connectedness, and social and economic resources to their members. The final key component of the family resilience approach is communication processes. In this context, families offer clarity, they offer open emotional expression, and they offer collaborative problem solving to their members in order to foster resilience. As a consequence of research into the interaction between family and resilience, we know that there are some well-defined family characteristics that promote resilience. These are stable, supportive home environment, parents that are involved in their child's education and activities, parents that have the same characteristics as the child, socioeconomic advantages that provide the resources that are needed at times of adversity, post-secondary education of parents, and faith or religious affiliations. Now, to finish off, let's talk about your future selves as potential healthcare practitioners. How does knowledge of yourselves help in your potential future occupation? Well, we know that if you understand your own strengths and weaknesses, then you will consider your clients as fellow human beings. And this improves your understanding, your communication, and your empathy that is directed towards your patients. We also know that improved self-management increases patient outcomes. This will protect you in that it will prevent burnout, and it will protect your clients or your patients in that it will reduce their complaints. So let's summarize the key points that have been made during the course of this lecture. There is a clear and well-defined relationship between vulnerability, coping, and resilience. It is important to build social capital such that we then have protective factors that help us in building resilience and overcoming vulnerability. It is important that we have social capital in order to reduce the risk factors that make us vulnerable. It is important to understand the different theories of coping such that we can promote concepts such as self-concept and resilience that can then be applied quite practically to a health environment. So, for example, in the context of understanding and dealing with chronic pain. And lastly, it is important that we understand the interrelationship between vulnerability, coping, and resilience, because we can apply that to ourselves in being able to self-care when we're working as healthcare practitioners. Thank you very much for your attention. The next few slides show the range of references that are used in putting this lecture together. And as always, I would encourage you to read much more widely than your textbook. Thanks again, and we'll chat again next week.